and welcome to my semester not quite from hell wrap-up. We have gotten mildly festive at Virginia Woolf's house and I've kind of dyed my hair. We'll see how long this lasts for. This semester was the one not quite from hell because it was very up and down. Lots of highs, lots of lows, but it evened out to be alright, I guess. But today I'm going to be talking about 4 books I read for 3 different gender studies classes because I'm in my 4th year of a gender studies and political science degree. I've almost done all of my political science classes, thank God. I only have 2 left, which I'll be doing next semester, so I'm focusing on catching up with all my gender studies courses, which is really hard. The first class I'm going to talk about is a seminar that I did on critical research methods in gender studies. And we started out by reading Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples by Linda Tuhawa Smith, who's coming from the context of being from Aotearoa. By drawing on cultural theorists like Fanon, Said, Miracle, Foucault, she's arguing that research was an integral part of colonialism and imperialism. The book is split into 2 sections, the first section being based in deconstructing. So looking at all the logics and codes of imperialism and how that relates to research. And in my experience, these first couple chapters were the most succinct and just best looks at the material, cultural, theoretical processes of colonial and imperial projects. However, deconstruction only gets you so far. So the second part of our book is looking at reclaiming non-hegemonic or indigenous ways of producing knowledge. The original intended audience for this book was for indigenous researchers in terms of building capacity and reclaiming knowledge making, but it has had very widespread success and has been used across many different disciplines. This is the book out of all my semester's readings that I recommend the most highly because it is so important, especially if you are someone who is invested in research in any way. The second class I'm going to talk about is a class that I did on men and masculinity, and we looked at various different things, but one of the books that we read, or the only book that we read I guess, is We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity by Bell Hooks. This was actually the first Bell Hooks that I have ever read, certainly not the last, but this book is really premised on the idea of debunking the myth that we live in a society or a culture that actually does love black men. There is so much in this book, but some of the themes in it are like parenting and family systems, which was just so helpful in just in general looking at the way that a patriarchal family system works and kind of systems of masculinity and what it does to fatherhood, and then obviously specifically encouched within black masculinity. Just generally the book is about how black masculinity was created and formed and responding to white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalism. This book just gave a lot of context and theorization that was really missing from my own education, and I also really highly recommend reading this one. It's also very accessible and easy, especially because Bell Hooks always writes from that kind of starting from her own experiences and moving outward a lot of the time. And the last class I'm going to be talking about, I read 2 books for it, and it was a class on transnational feminism. The first book that I read online, and I read 2 chapters, but it's by Lila Fernandez and it's called Transnational Feminism in the United States. The first chapter that I read, which is actually chapter number 3, she's taking Sarah Ahmed's idea of the effective economy and using it to unpack transnational representation in 2 specific films, which is Bandit Queens and Slumdog Millionaire. And then chapter number 4 that I looked at was looking at transnational feminism regimes of visibility. So in this chapter, she's arguing that transnational feminism is stuck in a regime of visibility where there are only certain sites that are seen as being worthy of transnational feminist study. So the trans and transnational is being literally reduced to border crossing as the space of globalization that needs to be studied. And so focusing specifically on things like export processing zones, where it misses entire networks of what's happening around the world in regards to globalization and even movement. And so this has material implications because that's where all resource and research goes, is to studying these very specific, visibilized areas of like globalization. The last book we're going to be talking about today is called Global Women, Nannies, Maids, and Sex Workers in the New Economy, and this was edited by Barbara Unreich and Arlie Russell Hochschild. This book is a collection of different essays by many different authors, looking at the feminization of migration and also of survival. There are a lot of like topics and themes that we looked at in this course coming from the books, some of them being like circuits of survival and like the chain of love, which is really interesting because it's this idea that so many countries are relying on exporting domestic labor, mostly like domestic work, which is highly feminized. And then these economies rely like solely on remittances or the money that is being sent back to families. But then also how these women who are having to leave their families and work as domestic workers in North America, in Europe, then have to pay at home for housekeepers and domestic workers to care for their own children. Also for that class, instead of making us all do a paper, we actually all collectively launched a blog called the One Heart Majority, and the basis or the idea behind it was to be able to disseminate this information outside of the classroom in a really accessible way. That is it for this semester. I am so happy to be done. Next semester is gonna be wild, so stay tuned. And like I said, you can watch the last two that I've done. So yeah, have a great day. I'll catch you with my top 5 books of the year, which is coming out soon. Bye.